With Red Bull's campaign continuing to yo-yo after Max Verstappen followed up his Imola victory with a fourth in Monaco, is the Spain front-wing flexibility reset going to turn its fortunes around? And what's really going on behind the scenes at the team? I'm Ed Straw, and joining me to tell all are Ben Anderson and special guest Matt Majendie. Well, Matt, always great to have a special guest making their debut. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself, present your credentials, tell us about the F1 project you're working on, and also where you are, because you're in quite an unusual location.
Yeah, I'll start with these sort of weird shafts of light above my head, but I'm in a radio booth at Roland Garros for the French Open tennis. I was at Monaco and I'm going to Spain, but I've got a few days here for the tennis in between. So it's a slight change of sports. So I skip across a few sports every now and again. But F1-wise, I did my first race in 2006 in Melbourne as a stand-in for someone at Motorsport News. I think they went off, their wife was having a baby, and that was the first race I ever attended. And I've done quite a lot of F1 since, but I've fluctuated in quite a lot of sports. I do Olympics, tennis, boxing, a mix. But then for this season, I'm doing something quite different. Sort of essentially embedded in the Red Bull team for the season. I'm doing this podcast called The Inside Track with BBC Studios, available on all good platforms, etc. But essentially what they've done, very kindly, they kind of given me access to all areas to the team. So if I take Monaco as an example, some quite surreal experiences in that I did hot laps of the circuit with Max Verstappen in a Ford Mustang Dark Horse. So I did two laps of that with him. When we hit about 120 through the tunnel, and he's chatting away, and I basically look, I'm sort of trying to headbutt him as I'm falling all over the seat. And then I ended up interviewing Yuki Tsunoda on a speedboat with a wakeboarder at the back of it. So slightly, a sort of Red Bull kind of as a wider company in a nutshell. And then you get good things like being in the engineering office for the race, which actually in somewhere like Monaco was fascinating. So I found that really fascinating. So actually the mix of stuff I'm able to do with the team has been brilliant. Really sort of fun project.
That sounds really good. When's that going to come out? That's obviously some way away, but worth listening to, I'm sure.
They've started doing them, but they've had a sort of slow build-up. So I presented with Rick Edwards, who's from 5 Live. So it goes out, every episode goes out every Thursday. On they've got a YouTube channel, but it goes out on all your other platforms as well from an audio point of view.
That's something I've learned. I thought they were coming out till later, so I need to catch up with those. I'm sure those are really great. Now, Ben, I won't ask you to show your credentials or tell us where you are, because all of this is very very mundane for you.
Well, it's never mundane to come on your podcast, Ed. Always enjoyable and very pleasurable to have an external guest as well. It sounds like we're going to get some really fascinating insight from deep within the Red Bull bunker.
Yeah, that's what this episode is going to largely be about, because it's an interesting time of the season with the Spain Flexi Wings stuff coming, and obviously Monaco, Matt, a very big contrast to what happened at Imola. So it was a difficult weekend in Monaco. You had that ringside seat, as you've described. So what can you tell us about what you saw with the struggles and how Red Bull coped with it?
So the most interesting thing is the engineering office bit I was mentioning. So where the garages, they're so tight and compact in Monaco. So you've got the garage at the bottom, and on the pit walls, the floor above, and the floor above is the engineering office next to where all the VIPs are. So I'm able to be plugged into there, so I can hear GP and Woody, the 2 race engineers, the drivers. I can hear Christian Horner. I can hear Pierre Vacher, who has some fruity language, it has to be said. You can hear Will Courtney as the head of strategy. Then also you can hear different engineers pop in at different points. Paul Monahan, pedals will pop in as well. And then you get stuff from the factory, which is fascinating. People looking at tiny adjustments on a front flap of whatever, things that seem really crucial, but as such minute details. And actually, I think that was a very boring race. But from my perspective, it was one of the most fascinating I'd been to, because there was just so much kind of going on in the background. Like I just almost couldn't keep up for 78 laps of ice. What was nothingness for a lot of people watching.
Yeah, I guess for them it was, once you get into the race, it's all about trying to create any opportunities. Obviously, they hung out for the red flag. There wasn't much that Verstappen could do himself other than hope that the cards fell his way. But even though, like you say, it looks simple, there's probably an enormous amount of discussion and analysis and trying to work out what opportunities can be created or made the most of to try and change the result.
Yeah, it was right from the outset. It was fascinating, because they were going to pit Yuki immaterial of Bortoletto going into the barriers. So their plan was to bring him straight in. So that didn't really change their plan. But then there's this sort of constant dialogue. Like you had the moments of like I'm fascinated by how teams observe other teams. So Paul Monaghan's looking very in depth at Norris's tyres to hope that there's been a flat spot from where he, just at the start there, spending a lot of time. Then you have them complaining and suggesting that Max got brake tested by Oscar Piastri twice, and he's complaining. And then they report it to the stewards, and nothing happens, and you hear all this dialogue. But the bit I found when they really come alive, there's spells actually where it's quite quiet, but they really come alive is when there was the possibility they thought they could get the jump on Piastri. I think it happened a couple of times around about lap 24, lap 49, 50, something like that. And there was a constant dialogue of like, we're 0.4 seconds ahead. There was just and they needed to get an absolutely perfect 2.5 second stop at most, and they could have got the jump. But it's interesting hearing GP's frustration. He was like, we're going to lose it. And he got this very calm voice of Will Courtney, which I thought was amazing how, he's the one that's essentially making that call to Christian and others. But GP was a bit irritated that the opportunity was missed at one point. He said, that's a bit sad. But I think the reality was from the team, I think it would have just come alongside Piastri. So fourth was realistic. They're the best they could hope for. And then you had the Yuki situation where obviously he was used to that way, but it didn't work because he really needed to have qualified higher up. You saw the teams that managed to bounce off each other well with like the Racing Bulls, because they were close together on the grid. They could work that out brilliantly, which Hajar and Lawson did a really good kind of double act, but Red Bull weren't possible to do that. There was quite a funny moment where they were sort of holding out at the end for this red flag for both drivers, and it could have been a masterstroke. They're just like, and then they sort of give up, and then suddenly Pierre Vacher comes over the radio and goes, well, Yuki's beeping slow anyway, and there was a bit of frustration there. But yeah, it was just I felt quite exhausted and exhilarated by the end of it because there's just so much going on.
I think it's a good example, isn't it, Ben, of just how much there is going on kind of under the surface, even in a straightforward race. There's all this unseen tension and communication and this whole sort of substrata that will never be seen from the outside, except very occasionally when people like Matt get to have a look at it and tell us all about it.
Yes, fascinating elements there, particularly the kind of knuckle moment of the strategy with Verstappen and trying to jump Piastri, because watching the race live, I didn't really pick up on him being a huge threat there. I knew they were going to play this kind of different game to try and get Max ahead of everyone and then hope for some kind of randomness to hand him victory. But I didn't really perceive at the time that he had a shot at finishing third regardless. It always felt like he was kind of on the back of that lead group effectively.
I think it was a little false though, because what happened each time Piastri's tyres took a couple of laps to come in, and so suddenly Max was able to, he needed those 2 laps to speed up and be able to catch him. But then Piastri's tyres suddenly came in, so at the point that he would pit, he'd lost the advantage. So I think if they're reflecting on the race, it was a slightly false advantage in the end.
Interesting. The bits where they're grassing up Piastri, I mean, that just we don't hear it, but we sometimes do, and that's just par for the course, isn't it? It's F1 teams always trying to take any little crumb of advantage they could possibly get for themselves. And the Tsunoda thing is funny because it just kind of tallies with what we get an external impression of, him not really quite performing as he needs to, and then that spilling into frustration in the team because they can't use him as a player, a chess piece, if you like, in the strategy in the way that they need to. You had McLaren didn't really do it in Monaco, but they had 2 cars up there, so they were in theory able to use them strategically. Obviously, the sister team did; they were the ones that played the 2-car strategy the best, if you like. And Red Bull just weren't able to do that because Yuki was so far removed from Verstappen. It's just quite funny to hear one of the teams, inside the team, saying, "Oh, Yuki, come on, where are you?"
And also, I liked that actually they never got a response from their complaint as well. Which sort of said it all, that there was no case to be heard. And then interesting, at the end, they were trying to, not telling Max to back up, Norris and Leclerc, sort of trying to create, but they were sending messages like they're only 2 seconds behind, they're lapping at this time, to essentially give him kind of said message that if you back up, maybe getting Leclerc to get the jump on Norris might create some chaos, and that could help to our advantage. But
well, it worked as well, didn't it? Because Norris was getting a bit tetchy about the fact that then Piastri was off the back of Leclerc, and he felt like he was under pressure, and he then needed help to kind of relieve that pressure. So it was, considering Red Bull were out of the picture in Monaco realistically for victory, they kind of played the race with Max probably about the best way they could.
Yeah, I think fourth was realistic, wasn't it?
I think the thing that's great about this, obviously, you described what Red Bull were doing during the race, talking about can they get Piastri, and there's another basic carbon copy group of people in orange having the same conversation, but on the other side of it, and being very, very aware of the threat and where they need to deploy the pace, which is when you see that the involvement of the team, it's not just pit stops and the basics of strategy, it's kind of constant and evolving. But I'm interested to know, I presume you were sitting in on engineering meetings earlier in the weekend as well, and as they were trying to, or at least got some sense of the battle they were facing with trying to get the car to work around Monaco, which, as Verstappen said, no matter what you do, it's just got a limitation and it's not going to be great over the curves. It's not going to be great in the slow corners. So did you get a sense of the kind of brick wall they kept hitting there?
Yeah, I think, they know that they skip from these weekends where things go very well to suddenly like a slow corner weekend, and they're in trouble. That curtails what they're capable of doing. I think I chatted to Dr. Marco before the race, and I think his thoughts was sneaking a podium would be the absolute best they could hope for, but they'd need a bit of fortune. I think perhaps from the outset of the weekend, third, fourth was probably the best they were hoping for. I think they knew Leclerc would probably go well. They didn't have answers, but then there's a lot of I know we'll probably chat about this in due course, but there's a lot of hope riding on Spain, and that'll be the turning point with changes. And no one really knows how that'll play out, I don't think. But I think they're holding on to sort of damage limitation up to that point. Max is only a one race win behind Oscar at this stage, which is, bearing in mind the difference in pace and consistency is pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely remarkable for him to be there. And I guess you got also a sense of the role Verstappen plays in that team as this kind of driving force. Obviously, people get glimpses of that from the outside, the way he communicates and talks, always just pushing for everything to be right down to complaining about the gear shift feel, which he's always picking up on, particularly early in the weekend. So how do you feel the team sort of builds around that Verstappen factor? Because he's a unique driver, isn't he?
He's everything, and he's so competitive. I know other drivers are like, he's so wants us to wring every single ounce out of everything he can do in every session, in every moment, in every briefing, etc. And that's quite a Red Bull way. They're all quite super competitive characters, so they bounce off each other very well. But what the bit almost more interesting than seeing this incredibly driven person is actually this quite down to earth guy, like doing the laps with him, for example, or just chatting to him within the team, seeing how the rapport between him and the mechanics is nice to see. He's just this sort of superstar who's super down to earth at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, isn't it? When you get a certain impression of Verstappen from the outside, certainly people watching will, but then when you see how the team really, really works, and although it's right to say it's built around him and what he wants, it kind of works, doesn't it? Because they know he's the guy who in the car will do the job like literally no other in terms of driving Red Bulls. So that he's the epicenter of the team, isn't he?
He's like their crown jewel. And, you almost sense there's a nervousness about that because they don't want to lose him, do they? They don't want to lose the very best driver there is. But he's the beating heart of it, and he knows it. But he's very humble and modest with it at the same time. He's not superstar airs and graces you might get with some others.
No, he's a simple guy, isn't he? That's the thing that there's always been there. He keeps it pure in terms of he's there to go racing. He's there to win. He's there to, as you say, extract every last ounce of juice he possibly can out of the package each weekend. But it's interesting that the sense you get inside the team of him being, as you say, the crown jewel, but also someone they're terrified of upsetting, losing, disappointing, is a sense we have outside as well. It's become, I guess it's the flip side of the coin, isn't it? Right? You need ideally every team wants a unicorn driver like Max, someone to build the project around and keep you in the hunt when you maybe don't deserve to be. But the flip side of that is if you don't have him happy, or you somehow contrive to lose that piece, then you're absolutely screwed almost.
Well, it changes the philosophy, doesn't it, as a team of what they're doing without that one pure focus. I mean, they made it clear that it's the drivers' championship, not the constructors. Maybe that's just a reality check because of where McLaren are. But Verstappen's the be-all and end-all for them.
What did you make of what you saw from Yuki Tsunoda? Because he had another one of those weekends where there were signs of promise. Qualifying didn't come together. I must admit, he sort of complained after qualifying about traffic and things not coming together. But actually, watching his final run in Q2, he had a pretty clear run overall. He only encountered one car across the two flying laps he did. So I think it was just not nailing it. But what do you see of his struggles and what the team's trying to do to get him up to speed? And do you think that there's the ingredients there for that finally to be a second driver that works, or just sort of going around in circles, not getting anywhere?
I actually do. I do think it'll work with him. There's so much positivity around the team towards him in terms of what he gives. He's much better in the technical stuff than I think I anticipated. The feedback he gives is actually very thoughtful and very detailed. Not saying stuff for the sake of it. But it's a bit more than I think I expected from him as driver, and that's gone down very well with his engineers and the wider team. But the thing is, nothing's quite clicked yet, and there's this sort of you feel this desperate push from the team in a positive way to kind of willing him to have a good result, and he needs to have one because you feel the pressure and you feel that spotlight if there's that disparity between you and your teammate, because he has to be getting in the points, he has to be aiding Max's chances, doesn't he, by being higher up the grid so they can have split strategies, etc., which they couldn't really do in Monaco and at some other races.
Yeah, that's the thing that concerns me with Tsunoda, is that, it's clear that he's a likable character. I think they like having him around the garage, perhaps, a chunk more than by the end a sort of mopey Perez who's just kind of disappointed with his life. But that only takes you so far. And ultimately, he's not playing the role he needs to play. And I know it's still early days, but I just feel like he's stuck in this same pattern. We see, he gets up to speed pretty quick. He doesn't do some of those really stupid like Perez FP1 crashes where he's just massively overreaching. He's kind of pretty good through Friday, sometimes quite good in the early part of Saturday, FP3, even Q1, he's kind of okay. And then he just plateaus. It's like, when I know the Red Bull's a difficult car, and it's being proven even more so by the number of drivers they stick in it and they can't get anywhere near Max. But they need him to take those steps through Q2 and Q3, and he just can't do it. It's
what
like,
do you think it is then? Do you think he feels the pressure, that pressure in those hits, because it's in Q3, it's in that as the moment gets more pressurized and tense? Is that it?
I think it's a mix of that certainly playing a role, but also how difficult the car is fundamentally. Like, I know some of the recent updates that Red Bull have put on the car have been designed to kind of broaden out that performance envelope, if you like. It's become, over a number of months, generically a car that's kind of too peaky and not easy to use. And Max has been able to go with it, and maybe even has driven some of that just in terms of his uniqueness as a driver. And then when you need to kind of dance on that edge to get the final bit of lap time, and sometimes it's a case of chasing it too, because other teams are more competitive. So I think they require the driver to kind of take a more aggressive setup choice, maybe a bit more front wing angle than they'd like. That makes the car even more difficult to drive. Max can go with it, but someone like Yuki, at the moment anyway, just seems a bit too limited to do that. And that's where the plateau comes in. And it's like, that peakiness means that because he can't access it and dance there, he ends up down in kind of 8th, 9th, 10th region at best, behind cars that in theory he could beat, but it's just too difficult to beat them.
I think also in that car, the way Verstappen gets the best out of it, if you kind of push yourself to actually push to the limit in the kind of conventional way, it almost doesn't work, because Verstappen's not kind of a maximum attack driver. It's all in the artistry. And if you watched the Tsunoda onboards in Q2, he was walloping a couple of curbs and that was just causing him problems. So it's like he was, and a few of the predecessors have had this same problem, that you kind of push yourself to brake later or take a little bit more curb or just grab a bit more track here and there. And that's not the thing that works. So I think it's just a really, really difficult technique to get on top of. But still, it's early days for Yuki, and he's surely going to get the rest of the season to make the breakthrough.
The other thing I think that hurts him is the thing that's kind of benefiting Isaac Hadjar in his rookie season, in that the racing balls he's come from is particularly drivable, let's not say easy, but accessible car. So they're almost diametrically opposed. And people were even asking, including Max, maybe a bit facetiously at the start of the season, is the racing balls a better car than the Red Bull RB21? Certainly a more accessible one. And I think that probably makes Yuki's life harder, because he's come from something where it's like, it just all flows naturally. Plus he built that kind of relationship with the team and familiarity. That's all gone. And he's jumped into something that's just so almost esoteric. It's got these quirks, and it doesn't quite make sense in terms of what you do as a driver and what you call upon to try and access the performance. And I think that's also tied up maybe in the technical difficulties that Red Bull seem to have had over the last kind of 18 months, 2 years, because it wasn't so long ago that, they were streaking away, capable of finishing 1-2 in quite a lot of races. And now that seems like an impossibility. So that whole element of them getting lost with the car and the tools, the simulation tools, not quite telling them what they need to know about the car, and then having to do these kind of on track back-to-back tests of things because they just don't know where they are. I think it's all tied together. It's the car is complex. It's complex for drivers who aren't Max, and it's complex in terms of the whole situation with the team, and it all just comes together into one kind of quite difficult thing to see your way through.
The final point on Yuki, Matt, what do you see about beyond that technical feedback that you've talked about, just in terms of his mindset and how he's dealing with it? Do you get a sense of it weighing down on him, the struggle, or is he just kind of normal Yuki behind the scenes working away, searching for that breakthrough?
He looks very relaxed. Like, he genuinely feels like there isn't the pressure there. I mean, I'm not there with him 24/7, so you don't see that sense. I think he's been told, you've got the season. That's the impression I get. You've got the season. Just chill out. That's the best sort of advice they can give him. But if you think about, Ben, what you were just saying about how complex a car this is to deal with, he's playing ridiculous catch up already by coming in a few races in. But then the complexity of this car to get to grips with, without having properly tested it. I know he's had some, time on track now, but there's still, he still hasn't had loads and loads of laps in that car. But he does know, he does have to deliver points. That's why he's been brought in, isn't it? He's got to deliver points, and when that doesn't happen, then that becomes onerous. And you see these Red Bull drivers can crumble under that pressure of Max, of that pressure of not performing. So I don't know. I really will him to do well because he is an incredibly likable, unique character.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of will to see him doing well inside and outside of the team. So hopefully he'll get the breakthrough soon. Okay, Ben, let's talk about the long-awaited FlexiWin technical directive that kicks in Spain this weekend. The permitted flexibility of the front wing during the load tests is reduced from 15mm to 10mm. So how profound a change is this, and what might its impact be?
That is a really good question. So if you talk to people like Fred Vasseur, he talks about it potentially being a game changer. I feel like for Red Bull, they really hope it will be a game changer because this is something they've been really pushing hard with the FIA to clamp down on, just general aero elasticity, not necessarily specifically the front wings, although it's obviously tied together. But at the same time, yes, the FIA can say, right, we're going to have this more stringent static load test, blah, blah, blah. But we all know that that's not really the key point, is it? It's about at what speed, when the car's in motion, that you can get your aero to do clever things. And yes, okay, now you've got to be careful because there's cameras everywhere and people are looking for kind of weird things happening with slot gaps and things bending a little bit more than they should and creating little chinks of light where they should be. But you can't eliminate it. So I feel like, yes, probably generally it's going to have some kind of impact. It can't have none. But I think it's very difficult to know exactly the range it will. It depends kind of where you are. I feel like there are teams that we know have made big strides in this area. McLaren, Mercedes, I think, made a big step last year going in this direction. Ferrari, actually, towards the end of the season, made a bit of a step. And then it feels like this year, you've got people playing a kind of waiting game. It's like, well, we have to go down this route, but we can't go too far down this route because we know this change is coming. And we can't throw our cars completely in the bin because we've got 2026 to focus on as well. So it's quite a complex kind of situation. It could have a massive effect, and teams that have been really advanced with it, like McLaren and Mercedes, could be pegged back. Equally, they may have worked out, because they're so far along in this kind of path, how to step it back without getting found out and wrecking the car balance. And then there's teams like Red Bull haven't really progressed in this area, who will just be kind of crossing their fingers like this and going, and we just hope that it kind of completely wrecks McLaren. And that's finally the silver bullet that it feels like they've been searching for with the FIA for months.
So, Matt, you were there with Red Bull. Was this a talking point that came up any point? Is there a feeling that Monaco was kind of the end of part one of the championship and this weekend's a new start? Anything you can tell us from the inside?
So it's funny, if you have the Christian Horner public message is, it's a big change for everybody, and it's not just as simple as the change of the wing, it affects the whole performance of the car, and the reality is we don't know who it's going to benefit, whether us or not. Now, if you first were having this conversation a few weeks back, the chat behind the scenes was, we just need to keep within McLaren. So when it comes to Spain, they haven't got too far away, and we can close the gap, and it'll be all change. And I think that was the message they felt this would be to their advantage more. Now, I think that's changing a little bit. Maybe when they're getting closer to it, that it might. Maybe there's, I don't know if fear is quite the right word, but definitely a belief or a possibility that it might not have as big an impact as they'd hoped. It might not give them as much of a leap. But what is exciting is I do still get the sense that no one quite knows what that differential is going to be. But I don't think it'll necessarily be a case that we get to Spain and suddenly, whoa, it's all completely different. I think they've made it clear it's going to be a few races before you see the reality. But then we'll kind of know where the championship is going, don't we? Whether it's just going to be McLaren disappearing onto the distance or a closer together field. I don't know how you guys, what are your expectations on how it'll change in Barcelona?
The interesting thing is, it's fairly rare for a change like this to have the impact that many talk about. I think probably the only time I can really think of something like this that came in mid-season that completely changed things was when they briefly had it was in 2011, wasn't it, Silverstone, they had the blown diffuser technical directive came in, then they rolled back on it, and that did shuffle the order a chunk for that race, but then it, of course, changed thereafter. But normally these things are subtle because it's not just about making the front wing flex to the maximum permitted and benefiting from that. It's how you benefit from it, how it infects the aero center pressure movement, all those sorts of things. It's a really complicated equation. And the one thing that does make me think there's a possibility it could cause trouble is obviously if you're using that front wing flexibility as the critical part of getting your balance across a wide range of corner speeds, which the McLaren's very good at, then there's a possibility that the reduction in the flexibility, and its reduction, not elimination, could have an impact. But I don't know. I'm not holding my breath for a completely seismic change. I don't think it's going to make the McLaren the fifth best car and the Red Bull the best all round. I just think it's way more three-dimensional than that, and that's perhaps, Matt, what Red Bull are kind of getting at, because it's very easy for it to be a benefit for them, but it doesn't change the fact their car is not so good in sort of on bouncing across the curbs in Monaco. I mean, it can help in slow corners to an extent, relatively speaking, shall we say. It won't improve them, but it might pull others back. But as you look into the detail, I imagine their view of it's got more three-dimensional as well.
Yeah, I think I'm looking at it in hope rather than expectation of a change, because it's just always fun when you flip things around. You know, it makes a difference. Expect the unexpected, but I guess we'll see soon enough.
I think the fact that it's been so well telegraphed rather than a change that's just coming in suddenly, you know, from like race to race moment, which requires kind of maybe panic changes that teams have to live with for a few races, potentially neutralizes the impact, because everyone's seen this coming and will have built wings ready for the test. So it feels like they've had, you know, when did this come in? I think it was December, January time, winter anyway, that we knew this was happening. So they've had months to kind of get themselves prepared, every team, whether you're doing well in terms of flexible aerodynamics or not. So I feel that that's in its nature going to make the kind of change less dramatic, because everyone's prepared for it. And then there's just this whole thing of, you know, balancing your resources from 25 to 26. How do you design your car for this year? If you're critical on the flexible front wing, you've basically built your car for 9 races, haven't you? Or 8 races, actually, because it comes in for 9. And that doesn't seem like the most sensible way to play the championship, because it's a 24-race championship. So I feel like every team, knowing this is coming, will have already made some of those tweaks downstream in anticipation, because you have to consider the whole car. You know the front wing change is coming. So I think everyone will just be way too prepared. And it would have been maybe more fun for the FA to keep their powder dry and say, oh, suddenly here you go, Barcelona, we're going to do this, because that has more potential to me to shake up the order.
I guess it's the one counter argument, isn't it, against those who will downplay the impact, in that people pushed back about bringing the change in for the start of the year. So, we've got to change what we're doing with our front wing design, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact it got deferred, sports, but this is the thing, isn't it? They can talk about it all they want, but until it's on track and tested and you see how it affects everyone, because it won't be the same impact on every team. Every team, if they were making the most of flexibility, will have to do something. So it'll have an effect, but how much it is, it's up in the air. And that's why I find it quite funny that what you say, Matt, about maybe Red Bull sort of slightly pulling back at it, because it's easy kind of well in advance just to say, yeah, that'll change everything. But when it actually comes down to it and you get into the world of the reality, it's never quite that simple.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense, even publicly and privately, that they don't quite know what impact it's going to have on everyone. I guess you don't know what everyone else is doing, but it's fun, and I like the sort of conjecture, then bouncing back and looking and seeing how that'll change. But there's definitely less of a bullishness, perhaps, about the change than there had seemed before if we went back a fair few weeks.
It's also felt to me like maybe something they just haven't been able to figure out for themselves. They've been the sort of most of the top teams, the most vocal against this kind of direction. And it feels like they've almost belligerently refused to go too far down that road, but probably also because the technical teams change so much. Maybe they just don't have the same expertise that they used to be able to maximise it. So it's kind of weird to me because it's always felt like Red Bull's been the team that's pushed the envelope of the regulations the best. They've been kind of ahead of the game, and the FIA's been catching up with them. I mean, Ed used the example of the blown diffusers. That was something that basically was there to new to Red Bull, wasn't it? And it helped, I think, Alonso win the Silverstone race in 2011 for Ferrari. Now it feels like that game is reversed, and it's McLaren who are kind of pushing the boundaries, and naturally, therefore, the focus is on them. And Red Bull has kind of been caught a little bit short, and I don't know how that kind of sits with the guys internally, but they don't feel like themselves. It feels like they're more paranoid than they used to be, and they're kind of chasing these ghosts around. And also for them to be the one kind of throwing the mud at another team, hoping that it kind of pegs them back a little bit. It's almost like they've become, was it poacher turned gamekeeper or the other way around? I'm not quite sure if I've got the got the cliche correct.
But how about that paranoia, Matt? There's been a lot of that from Red Bull in terms of what they suspect McLaren were doing. Has any of that surfaced in front of you?
So when I say it's access all areas, there are still things I'm definitely not privy to. There's some engineering briefings that I've had the door very politely shut in my face, not rudely, but So that I'm still only a third into the season, so actually the time with the team's been limited. I don't know enough about that, but I think it'd be interesting to be part of those conversations of the head honchos with like Christian and Pierre and all of those figures talking about that. But there does feel that they're trying to, I don't know, sometimes with these things, I think that they're just perplexed as to what McLaren are doing. And so you naturally in Formula One think, well, someone must be cheating or pushing the boundaries, but there is a head scratching. And so, I guess it's human nature to point the finger as well as try and resolve your own issues.
It's also, I think, quite understandable from their point of view because the flip around is remarkable. Like McLaren are doing generally to the field what Red Bull used to do to them only a couple of years ago. And there's so many tracks now that we go to where you would say, well, Red Bull are strong at that track. I know we've talked about the low speed thing and there are particular weaknesses at like street tracks where, the ride has to be raised massively and the compliance is massively important. They're so specific. So your Monacos and your Singapores, you can kind of write those off. But there are tracks, like Bahrain, China, Miami, Budapest, these places where they used to dominate or reasonably so. And now they can't get near McLaren. And I can see how that would kind of feed a sense of, what are they doing? Like, how can this turn around so much? And it all just seems to have hinged on Miami 2024 and Imola 2024, where the McLaren suddenly took a massive leap forward with this kind of update that was on one car and then on both. And obviously Red Bull then updating their car for Imola. And just that's where everything seemed to fall apart because they had such a good run through those first few races and then got lost. And it just seems like they've never, maybe they're just starting to, but it's felt like they've never really been able to get that back. This kind of mismatch of the tools telling them one thing, the track telling them something different. Verstappen kind of being the one to spot that their control of the aero center of pressure is completely different to how it was the year before, but it taking until Monza to do that. Another track where previously they'd finished 1-2. So you wonder if they kind of just felt like they had everything kind of under lock. And then suddenly it just kind of unexpectedly got blown up. And it's baffled me that they haven't been able to really figure it out. And even now, where they're hanging in the Drivers' Championship, Max is winning a few races, McLaren are even, punching back and saying, well, the Red Bull's not that bad. Max has got this many poles and he could have won this many races. But there's a clear trend. Like if the track is high speed and the deg is low, the car is good. But on these other kind of more compromised tracks where you need a different compromise on the balance, they just can't do it. And it doesn't even have the strength in tyre management. Like Max used to thrash the field because he could look after the rear tyres much better than anyone else. He can't now. He just can't do it. And that efficiency in a straight line, it felt like they built their first generation of these cars to be really good in the races and overtaking once they got the weight out of it. That's gone as well. They're having to run more wing to kind of to help with the compromises on the balance and give Max something to work with over the qualifying lap. It's amazing to me how it's kind of fallen apart like that.
Ben, do you think it's down? You sort of touched on the personnel thing. Do you think that's an aspect? I mean, like you can mention lots of different people, like Rob Marshall, for example, or is it down to that in your view, or
that's it feels like it, doesn't it? Like it. No, whatever the catalyst for those changes, it just feels like the end of an era. Like Rob Marshall seems like a guy that must have made a massive difference in terms of coming out of Red Bull, a bit of an unsung hero, I guess. And then he plugs into McLaren and bang, they're suddenly, the trendsetter, aren't they? But also someone like Newey, I know a lot was made of, how the technical team felt that he was this kind of figure that just sucked all the glory. And even though he was kind of pretty much part-time or a glorified consultant, but, he has this pragmatism to him. Like how many times has he dug that team out of trouble? This isn't the first generation of cars that they've messed up at the start of a season and had to fix. He was so good at kind of problem solving and taking a step back from, what the numbers are saying and what the tools are saying. It feels like they're flat-footed compared to how they used to be. And I know inevitably teams go through cycles and you can't keep the band together forever, but it does feel like they've lost some key people, and for all the remaining strength there is in that organisation. I mean, you mentioned Will Courtney. He's not there for much longer, is he? So it just feels like that whole, we've said it before on the show, the empire crumbling. It does feel like kind of a slow descent, and Max is kind of holding them up, actually. And then that has good and bad to it, because it's keeping them competitive and means they can still win races, but they're so reliant on him to do that, and that's an unhealthy situation. So yeah, it's difficult to kind of see where this kind of all levels out. I mean, I guess the rule change is what they're hoping for, but then that's fraught with peril too, because Honda, the partner they've built their most recent success on, they're leaving too. So it's a very difficult time for Red Bull, I think.
But I guess, Matt, from what you've seen, the team, in terms of the way it's operating trackside, is still pretty strong, pretty much as strong as it's ever been. Do you see any cracks appearing, or
no?
is
I
it
don't.
just doing the job?
I feel there's a real togetherness in that team. Actually, I'm really impressed by how they work together. There's some people who've been there a long time. They know what they're doing. There's some very, very intelligent people, with far bigger brains than I could ever hope to have, who I think are fantastic. I don't think it's quite as bleak as that, in terms of, obviously they've lost some key figures, and that, I guess, that happens in Formula One, and that probably, I don't know, cost cap part of that in terms of cost of that, and there's this inevitable merry-go-round of people. But I sort of see this team building. I know it's all about Max, but it feels like there's a bit of a rebuild going on. I mean, who knows, in whatever it is, a few days' time, they might suddenly disappear off into the distance in Barcelona. We'll be having quite a different conversation. But it feels like it's going in a positive direction. That's certainly the impression I get. But as I say, I haven't been behind every single closed door, so you don't know some of the heated conversations that inevitably go on in fraught moments.
I think whatever happens, Spain's going to be quite an important weekend in terms of the overall shape and narrative of the season. So this time next week, we're going to know a lot more about that.
How would you like to win a Ferrari cap signed by either Charles Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton? We've got these incredible prizes to offer 2 lucky winners, courtesy of our friends at Monaco Inside Track, who offer walking tours of the roads that form that iconic F1 circuit, full of detailed insight about the history of that incredible race. To enter, all you have to do is be a member with us on Patreon. Then head to our competition post and comment with the name of the Ferrari driver whose signed cap you'd like to win. You can only enter once, but you are allowed to say both drivers. And as an added bonus for anyone in our Champions tier, you'll be granted a double entry if you take part. This competition is open to anyone with an active membership in either our Racers tier or the Champions tier. So head to the link in the description of this episode to enter before the competition closes on May 31st.
And you can currently get 75% off your first month with us as we celebrate F1's 75th birthday. So hurry and sign up. Don't miss out.
Talking of the Race Members Club, we're going to turn over the final part of the podcast to them by tackling some members' questions. These, Matt, in case you're wondering, are ones sent in by our listeners. They send in many, many questions and we don't get through enough of them, but we always try to throw them in. So a Red Bull one for you first from George. Has this weekend, being Monaco, shown that over the course of the season, Red Bull lacks the speed on all circuits to win a championship?
I think as things stand, yes, because, you've got these great weekends like the Suzukas, the Imolas, where they're absolutely flying and their pace is as good as, if not better than McLaren, and that's great, but they don't have the consistency. I mean, we've talked about it earlier in this, that those low corner circuits, they are not there yet. Saying that, I mean, I know we've touched on some of that, but the Imola upgrades they brought in, they feel like there's a wider window for this car now in which this car can perform better. So like they had this tiny narrow window where only just real fine lines that it would perform well. That they feel those widening, and so they're talking about going in this positive direction. Whether that's going to solve the issues with the flexi wing change as well around their low corners, I don't know. But as it stands, he's 25 points behind. I know I said that before, which isn't loads and loads, but they do need to get more consistent. Otherwise, McLaren will disappear into the distance. I mean, I feel like they are with the constructors, but with the drivers, he's sort of just clinging on. At some point, he's got to have to kind of peg back the gap and do well at circuits where habitually the car at the moment hasn't done.
I think the worry for Red Bull, or the note of caution, because Monaco is never going to be an indication of winning the championship. It's so specialist. We talked about Ferrari before being the king of the outliers and Monaco being one of those. I think part of the reason they're in a mess is that they've tried to become a team that can operate in more circuits and actually fight for the championship broadly. And Monaco's one you have to write off to do that, and they're going through some pain. I think Red Bull deliberately, at the start of this rule cycle, wrote off tracks like Monaco to chase performance at a more high speed, downforce compromise circuits. But even with the Imola upgrades that you mentioned, Matt, and Red Bull just being in a generally okay place with Max hanging in there as an outsider in the championship, those wins he's had, or those poles he's had, they've been nicked by like the tiniest margin. He's just nabbed a pole in Japan because one of the McLaren drivers messed up the chicane. He's just managed to nick Imola because Piastri was a bit dozy into the first corner. Like, there is no longer a Red Bull Max Verstappen race where he gets pole by 3 or 4 tenths and disappears down the road. But McLaren, with either driver, depending on who's feeling it that weekend, is capable of that at quite a few tracks. That's the thing, because Max, as good as he is, can't be perfect at every track. And I just feel like unless they can make a big proper performance step that buys them some margin and also lifts Tsunoda into the hunt, there's no way he's going to get the championship done. If he does, it will be the greatest smash and grab there's ever been in Formula One, in my opinion.
And again, that's a question that could have a very different answer in 7 days' time, isn't it?
yeah, very much so.
Our next question for you, Ben, from Thomas Knights. Does the fact that both McLaren drivers now have more points than any constructor show that the Constructors' Championship is all but a foregone conclusion? Some complicated maths for you there.
Yeah, I think that basically is saying that they're miles away from everyone else, aren't they? I mean, I'm tempting fate to say that they've got it locked down because you just never know. But I do feel that unless McLaren has some kind of huge performance swing against them, or they run into a massive run of races where reliability lets them down, or the drivers crash into each other, then I can't see anyone beating them. I felt like the start of the season, Ferrari maybe had the potential in terms of consistency of the drivers to do it, but that China double disqualification has wrecked their season, as well as the car not being good enough. And in terms of the other teams, well, Mercedes are not as competitive as they like to be consistently. Antonelli's still learning. And obviously, as we've talked about endlessly, Tsunoda's just not there in terms of supporting Max. So I think Red Bull could be in the hunt if they had 2 Maxes, or a 75% of Max in the other car, but nobody does. So just by the virtue of McLaren being the best car on the grid and them having 2 drivers who are capable of extracting everything from it most of the time, they're by far and away the favourites for the constructors.
Next question I'll take first from Bailey Sturris. Was Monaco the first sign of a great team environment and race strategy from Racing Bulls? Well, I'd say there are some good aspects to the team environment at Racing Bulls. I think Laurent Mekies, in particular, his leadership there has had a big impact on that team, just evolving it to the next step. But I did like the way they committed to that strategy in the race, and they were right to do so. They executed it brilliantly. They didn't hold back. They said, right, we are absolutely going to maximise what we can do, make Lawson the rolling roadblock in the first stint, and it worked fantastic. They maximised their points. I don't know how much attention you were paying to Racing Bulls and how much they were a topic of conversation in the world of Red Bull, Matt, but what did you make of what was going on there in Monaco?
Yeah, I guess it's a bit different in Monaco because they've got this big energy station, the teams. So the teams share this same place. So there's more interaction between Red Bull and Racing Bulls at this race, I think, than any other one. But yeah, I was really impressed with that. They were like, it's just going to put everything down on this plan, and it worked perfectly. I've been very impressed by Hadjar, and actually I thought Lawson did a good job of just holding up traffic and cars behind him. They probably had the best, after McLaren, probably the best success of a team. Would that be fair? Of the best strategy. It didn't work quite so well from other teams, what they tried as a double act.
They got a little bit fortunate, didn't they? Because the Lawson result relied on other teams reacting and copying what they did, which for them Williams did and then Mercedes did. So that kind of protected Lawson. But there was
always a good chance of that.
Yes, and they were also prepared to throw Lawson's race away, and they got him to buy into that from the start. So that's the impressive thing, that they, as Ed said, they committed to it, and they were like, let's make sure Hadjar gets the best result possible, and if we have to lose the second car from lower points, then we'll do that. But it happened to work out basically in the best way it could have done for them. But the other thing I find funny is that early in the race, there was lots of commentary about, Lawson's being used to make a gap for Max to pit into. So there was this kind of feeling that the two teams were collaborating. But the fact that Red Bull committed straight away to the Tsunoda Hail Mary, we're going to pit him at the end of the first lap, come what may. Well, Lawson playing roadblock completely ruined that strategy for anyone who was hoping to then benefit later on. So it's clear that there was no collaboration, even though they were sharing the energy station.
It's interesting you say that, because over the race radio, there wasn't a single mention of Racing Bulls and what they were doing. So you're absolutely spot on. Yeah, there was nothing, because I was intrigued whether, seeing how the grid was laying out, would that be something? But yeah, not in the slightest.
Yeah, I think they've got to be very, very careful about doing that. It would have been fairly obvious if they'd done so. And I think with another team, it's the problem of having one entity owning two teams. I think they'd have been on very, very shaky ground with that, and that would have caused a hell of a stink. Then again, you never know.
Quite fun.
It would have been, it absolutely would have been. And that temptation will probably always exist. Maybe there's other subtle ways they can do it. I've never got the sense they've really resorted to that, though. I mean, you can do things. You can do things legitimately to leave a car in a way, but you can also do things that go too far. So I think they're quite wary about that whole thing. But on a related note...
Ed, before we move on, you mentioned Laurent Mekies kind of taking that team to the next level. I'm quite interested in why you think that is, because obviously that team was, for a long time, had a huge stability in terms of its leadership and team principles. So what's he done that's different to how that team was before?
Well, I think he's gelled very well with the team culture, so he's not dramatically changed it. But I think he maybe almost fits in with it a little bit better than Franz Tost did, because Franz Tost is a much more sort of regimented sort of character, a more didactic character. That's not to say Mekies isn't in charge of it, but he really loves the ambience in the team, the way they communicate, the way they work, and I think he's kind of lent into the way that the team culture works, but also you've got the challenge there of kind of making the two sides of the team work, because there's the UK side and the Italian side as well. So that's quite important. And I think he is in a position to actually kind of understand both sides quite well and help them gel, because there's always little cultural differences in terms of the way you communicate, the way you work, and you have to make sure that you work well within them in order to actually make it work. You can't kind of force the square pegs into the round holes, and that team did generally have a bit of a habit of underachieving, and they still may be in the process of that, because it's not like everything's been perfect this year. They made some mistakes earlier this year. Australia, kind of understandable with the way the rain came. China was just flat-footed on strategy, but
they've learned from that.
and I do think that the way Mekies is sort of evolving that team since he's taken over. It was quite a sort of quiet start, but I sort of get the sense that it's just working quite nicely. They've changed a few things technically, and it's potentially getting it to the point where that team can be more consistent. So I don't think that team needs to be at the front fighting for wins, but it needs to be consistently making the most of the machinery, which they haven't done yet, but that they could be on a road to doing that. So let's move on to a question now for you, Matt, from 928 Pilot in a similar realm. Is it time to start talking about Isaac Hadjar in the second Red Bull seat next year? He's quick, smart, and has good racecraft. It's getting stronger. He's been the most consistent rookie this season. We have addressed this question recently ourselves, and I think my suggestion is, what's he done to deserve that curse? But do you get any impression of what Red Bull make of what Hadjar's doing? Because we know they were sceptical about him when they put him in.
So actually, I chatted to Dr. Marco before the race. I was chatting with him and a couple of the Dutch journalists about the young drivers and Hadjar in particular. Just observing Hadjar at the weekend, he's really confident. Like, he carries like a real confidence about the place. And I hadn't really seen him up close and personal so much. Very popular figure, all eyes on him. Everyone seems to be, there's a real sort of soft spot for him. And talking to Dr. Marco, very impressed by him. But at the same time, in his inimitable style, he then starts talking about the other drivers. So not just about Hadjar, maybe, but, Arvid Lidblad and others as well. Like, they've just got this talent pool. And so perpetually, we always have this conversation of who's going to hop up next. There's no sense at this point that Tsunoda's going to lose that drive. But if Hadjar keeps on doing strong finishes like that, then he becomes into the conversation, doesn't he? I don't know what you guys think.
I think
if they bin Tsunoda for next year, it's Hadjar will go outside the driver pool, isn't it? Really, I can't see any other alternative.
I feel like Hadjar's a sort of bonus for them. I think, like, as Ed, when he framed the question, said they were sceptical. So the fact he's had such a great start is probably a little bit of a surprise to Red Bull, even though they probably wouldn't like to admit that publicly. And it feels like Lindblad is the second coming. Like, they've had a kind of rough spell, with the kind of going back to the Gasly Albon experiments, and then obviously chucking in Perez, which at the time was the right thing to do. Those things have kind of run their course, not worked out in the long term. They've been kind of waiting for, as Ed would call it, the next cab off the rank. There's no excuse for them not to have several ready cabs, but the cabs have just been a bit faulty and not been quite up to standard. And I feel like Lindblad is the one they feel is like the next guy who's really going to do it. And if Hadjar happens to be one who's kind of, as drivers do, Damon Hill was a bit like this. You get to Formula One and suddenly it all clicks and you suddenly look like more than maybe you did before. Then they'll be in a good position again because they'll have Hadjar and Lindblad. And then suddenly this whole kind of Tsunoda, Lawson, Perez hangover thing can kind of, it's easier to navigate through, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel with Hadjar, though, they'll be better off giving him a few years to build up. That would be my concern. I don't know what you make of it, Matt, whether you feel that Red Bull would consider Hadjar to be the one they have to take, whether they'd be concerned. I feel like if he was in the Red Bull next year, it's not that it wouldn't be merited, but it would be earlier than ideal, and it would be kind of by default, as keeps happening, in that you've just got to put the next one in.
So do you think they'd learned a lesson? They don't want to rush a driver into that seat, or?
Well, I don't think they want. Yeah, the thing is, I don't think they want to, but I think they feel forced to, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Also, like, if you imagine the era of Mateschitz, like, it's a bit like the Alguersuari Buemi thing, isn't it? Like, Ed, I think you've told this story where, they were persisting with those drivers, and then I think it was Adrian Newey had said, well, they're never going to be Red Bull drivers, and Mateschitz was like, well, why are we persisting with them then? Like, change the lineup. I feel like if Hadjar just keeps doing what he's doing, and he's inevitably or inexorably the next best Red Bull driver behind Max, even though he's not in the Red Bull, they can't not put him in that car, because that just by definition is massive underperformance from Tsunoda. But I do agree with Ed. I don't think it's the right thing to do. And it's funny that Hadjar, when he's interviewed now, and he's obviously getting interviewed more because he's doing well, he keeps saying how lucky he is to have a really good car as a rookie, and praising how well Racing Bulls are doing. I think he recognises that, like, that's a really good environment to be in, and because they've actually, and to their credit, they've gone from being this team that was quite kind of specific in what they were strong at. They could get low speed performance but at the expense of high, or they could get high at the expense of low. They didn't really have a particularly broad range of circuits they could be strong at. They've really kind of nailed that now. So he's in probably the best seat he could be in, and as Ed said, he doesn't really want to have the curse of going into the second Red Bull seat too early. Do you think that's what he's saying then in those interviews, saying, yeah, please don't grab me? I think he's intelligent enough to know that he doesn't need to have too much too soon. When you're Tsunoda and you've been in F1 for 4 or 5 years, you can't not go into the Red Bull. That's an admission of defeat, isn't it? And even though he's now up against this humongous challenge and he's got the biggest mountain ever to climb, you've got no alternative. But for Hadjar, it's a bit like Test cricket. You've got to play your way in, I think. And the fact that Hadjar hasn't looked like a guy who could just drop in and do anything, like a Max Verstappen, means that he will probably more benefit from a kind of gentle bringing up to speed and learning those lessons a little bit more out of the limelight.
At the same time, if Red Bull decides to dispense with Tsunoda, he could be thrown in 26, and you've just got to try and make the most of it, which is not easy. But Red Bull's perhaps not been the best at easing the drivers through the ranks, certainly when it gets to F1. Right, Ben, a gloriously random question from Gareth Langley. With Max Verstappen wanting to take a trip to 1972 through his gear shift comments during the Monaco Grand Prix, which race in the past would you like to compare parts of a car to? Was Alonso's engine reminiscent of Silverstone 94, for example? It wasn't smoky enough, was it?
I feel like Alonso's engine was reminiscent of Alonso's engine from 2015 in the McLaren Honda. He's had plenty of ERS failures and smoky exits from Grand Prix. Max didn't want to go back to 1972, did he? He just felt like his gearbox was going back there, which I think was quite a harsh way of saying. Actually, it's something he complains about a lot. The sync of the shifts. I don't know if there's a sort of acceptance within Red Bull, Matt, that their gearbox is not maybe as clean or as smooth as they'd like it to be.
It does seem to be a repeat thing, doesn't it? The only thing I wanted to say on that one is actually when he made that comment, and then there was titters, little giggles down the team radio, which really made me laugh. And then GP comes in and goes, "Okay, Max, understood." Like with a straight face. It just really made me laugh, that dynamic of it, because it was a great comment.
Yeah. GP has a really good way of kind of like sarcastically undercutting some of Max comms, doesn't he? He says it in this really dry way, but you could, even on the TV, you can pick up the humour in how he's responding.
A good double act, aren't they, in terms of entertainment value? But very funny.
Let's go. The only thing I'd be comparing is maybe Liam Lawson's rear wing to the rear wing of Enrique Bernaldi's arrows from David Coulthard's perspective. In fact, multiple drivers were filling that role, but that's what I'd compare it to. Right, the last question from Yeti Storm that I'll take. Why is refuelling not a point of discussion? It makes the car smaller because you need less space for fuel, gives teams more things to play with on strategy, and it's safe these days. Just look at WEC. Yeah, safety wouldn't be a huge problem with that. They don't like carrying the equipment around because it's hugely heavy. They've moved to these more efficient engines, trying to reduce the amount of fuel they're using. I'm wary about refueling because people say it gives more strategic options, but actually in many ways it doesn't, because it kind of sets you on a path. Sometimes often in the refueling area, you'd have a case that Schumacher was always doing this, where Schumacher would be starting third because he qualified on a heavier fuel weight. And really, he was leading that race from the start, but just needed it to cycle through. Yeah, there were sometimes cases where you get clever strategies like the famous Manicourt four-stopper where, because the Michelin was strong in the first few laps, he couldn't out-qualify it, and it wasn't quick as kind of at the start of runs, but they just needed to create space, and then you put the car in the space and you jump, and that happens sometimes, but usually it just happens. I don't know if anyone's a big refueling fan here. I do agree in the case of that Monaco Grand Prix, it could have made things a little bit different, but because it would have locked in your kind of range strategy, if you see what I mean. But
I'm not a huge fan of it. I agree with you completely on the kind of strategic uniformity you end up with, because there's always the fastest way to run a race, and teams just work it out and end up doing very similar strategies, and there isn't really an option to kind of do something massively different. Yes, okay, it helps in terms of the nimbleness of the cars and creating these kind of more flat out stints, but also it reduces unless there's a failure of the fuel rig, which is like catastrophic and you can't fuel the car up, it makes the pit stops less tense. I remember watching those refueling races, and they come in, change the tyres, and then they're just waiting around for the fuel to flow into the tanks. And then you get into the games of, who's got a faster fuel rig, and they have to limit them, and then people try to work around that so they can fuel faster than anyone. I think leave it in the past. I don't think making F1 more like sports car races is the answer.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think, that it's interesting you said about that pit stop. It's all about the entertainment now, isn't it? And actually that is great, seeing a 2.2 second or whatever, having that moment where you're sitting there, someone with cumbersome thing, just waiting and waiting and waiting.
Oh, come on, it won't go on. Yeah.
A bit tedious, isn't it? Apart from, where things do go wrong. I wouldn't be a fan of it coming back.
It's also worth noting that the tyres, the way they are at the moment, wouldn't work well with refuelling, because obviously one of the main methods of overtaking on fueling on tyres that were working well is you could actually overcut more often rather than just the undercut. So I think it's always worth considering, but I don't get any sense F1 sees it's a good idea. And people want to see, people are always saying they want to see overtaking. Well, refueling actually reduces the chances of that happening, because there's better ways to do it. So yeah, look at it, but I don't think it's going to be coming in. Well, thanks very much to everybody for those questions. Thanks, Ben, for turning up, and thanks very much, Matt, for taking time out of the tennis. You didn't not a single foot fault, no code violations in this. We're going to throw in all of the puns now right at the end of it. So did a good job, but yeah, perhaps one last chance.
You aced it, Matt. You aced it.
It's beautiful. Beautiful.
Absolutely. Perhaps we should just give you one last chance to plug the podcast as well, and where people can find it.
Yeah, it's the Inside Track with me and Rick Edwards, and it's in all good podcast places, but we also have a YouTube channel. It's the Inside Track _podcast.
I'm sure you almost had all good bookshops there as an author as well. You're used to that.
In time.
Excellent. Well, thanks, everyone. Definitely have a listen to that podcast. I'll be certainly checking it out. I thought it was coming out later in the year for some reason. So I've got some catching up to do. But yeah, there's going to be some big questions answered this weekend. So stay with us for everything you need to know about the Spanish Grand Prix.